I want to welcome a man that almost needs no introduction in the great state of Mississippi, and especially in and around Starkville, Mississippi. A guy who is well known at genepage.com, a Mississippi State man himself, Steve Robertson. Welcome to the Mitch Davis Show. How are you doing, and how are things in Starkville, Mississippi?
Man, things are great, man. I love it. It's it's baseball season, so it's kind of our time of year, and the season hadn't gone quite as well as we had hoped, but a lot of baseball left to be played. And certainly a big series coming up this weekend that maybe doesn't have the national acclaim that it did last year, but means an awful lot to both teams and both fan bases.
I want to ask you about this rivalry. Obviously, you've written a numerous amount of books talking about Mississippi State and Ole Miss, and obviously everybody knows your deal with Mississippi State. But what does this rivalry mean to the state of Mississippi, not only in football, but especially on the baseball side of things?
Well, it actually goes back to the 1800s. It's like Mississippi State and Ole Miss really could not be any different. Now it's a lot. The fan bases are a little more similar today, but back in the 1800s, basically Mississippi State was kind of the farming school, and you had a lot of people that maybe didn't have that. I guess the wherewithal to do a lot of things that they did. And so they came to Mississippi State to learn to farm more efficiently. And, originally way back when I wrote about this in Stark Villains, when the Moral Land Grant Act was passed as part of it, admitted or not, I think most would, they have a tremendous amount of respect for Ole Miss baseball. And of course they want to beat them. But I think we all know from being in the state how difficult it is to win consistently in this grinder of a league that we have. And I think a lot of people look at Mike Bianco and say, you know what, hey, he hadn't quite gotten over the hump, but this guy has made this rivalry actually mean something. Because for decades, State was just simply the better program. Outside of it, opportunity in the early 70s, when State and Ole Miss, kind of alternated as the kings of the SEC West. By and large, since that time, it's been all Mississippi State. And then, early 2000s, Ole Miss has a little window of success. And I think Bianco is kind of like, people are like, you know what, hey, it's kind of fun having these series that actually mean something. When I interviewed Rafael Palmeiro for Alpha Dogs, I asked him, I said, hey, what's your favorite moment in the rivalry? And he said, what rivalry? He said, our objective back then was to beat LSU, or to beat Florida. We didn't look at Ole Miss as a baseball rival, but people certainly do now. And, for decades, Ole Miss fans always kind of looked up at Mississippi State and said, hey, we don't want to just be like the little brother in this baseball thing. We want to be relevant. And they have been, for the past 22 years.
Speaking of this rivalry, obviously things in Oxford are not going the way that Ole Miss fans expected. But Mississippi State is catching fire. Talk about this matchup. What do you expect to see out of both Ole Miss and Mississippi State this weekend in Oxford?
Well, I'll tell you, the first thing that jumps out about Ole Miss to me is, the lack of pitching depth. State has kind of struggled with that too, but I think even the most, probably dyed in the wool Ole Miss Rebel fan would say that this pitching situation at Mississippi State is probably settled a little bit. The bullpen still has some room to grow, shall we say, but both teams are underachieving. I think that is probably the big point in all of this, is that State and Ole Miss both were expected to challenge for a top 8 national seed, and now both are going to be very fortunate to make a regional. And I think the latest projections from both D1 Baseball and Baseball America has State and Ole Miss out of the field. I do think one of these teams will make the field, and I do think it will be Mississippi State. But in order to do that, they've got to find a way to get a win this weekend. But this Ole Miss team, what Tim Elko can do, and he's such a great player. He really, really is. And there's so many people that talked about his character as a person, as a player when he got injured last year. And you always hate to see that. But, he comes back. I think that's good for the game. He's got 15 dingers this year, leading the team in hitting. You got to pitch around that guy. And unfortunately for Ole Miss this year, people have found some success doing that because there hadn't been a lot of players that have been able to pick him up. And, I guess they have, 61 home runs, 62 home runs this year. And 15 of those are from Tim Elko, and the other 11 of those are from Jacob Gonzalez, who I think when you begin to look at the all-around picture, I think he is Ole Miss's best player. I don't know that he has had the year that many anticipated. I think he's hitting around 268, 270. You'd like to have that average come up a little bit. But this is a lineup that can hurt you. If you get out there and you get sloppy, and you leave balls up, especially in that ballpark. They're really good in their own ballpark, and I know the SEC record is 0-6, so that kind of contradicts what I've said. But they're built for that park, and if you go in there and let them hit their pitch, they can hurt you. So State's got to be careful to go in there and keep the ball down and not allow those big guns to really influence a game.
For Mississippi State, obviously heading into this matchup with Ole Miss, everything is riding on the line. Give me your predictions for Mississippi State and give me one or two of your keys heading into the series.
Well, I think the number one key is State's got to get quality starts. You can't, especially early in the series, you cannot have, a 4 or 5 pitch outing from Brendan Smith. He's got to work deeper in ball games. He's got to get 6 or 7 innings, and he's a real Bulldog too. And I think really for the first time this year, he's working on 7 days rest. So that's beneficial there. That's got to be a tone setter for State. You got to get 6, 7 innings out of him. And then maybe Casey Hunt can get you those final 6. And then you've got to get a good start out of Preston and Cade Smith. But, I think that's really when you look at the two teams, where do you see an advantage? Both teams can be very offensive. They're good mistake hitters, but State's had better starting pitching consistently. Parker Stinnett was a guy that was kind of up and down. He is now off the weekend, but Brandon's got to be a tone setter. You got to go out there and win that Friday game. And Ole Miss has been very, very inconsistent in game 3s this year. Very, very inconsistent. And that's because you run out of pitching. And so I think State's got to get quality starts. And the second thing that I would say, State's got to get into that Ole Miss bullpen. You've got to be able to chase starters out of there, maybe 4th, 5th inning, 6th inning at the latest, and get into that Rebel bullpen that has been very, 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 very porous at times this year. And that's, I'm sure Ole Miss is kind of looking at the game plan the same way State is. We got to get quality starts. But State is really good at grinding you out. They'll let you walk them. And then that's one thing early in the year they really weren't doing a good job of. Guys are pressing. Everybody's trying to hit a 5-run home run. And there's a lot of guys that are draft eligible. So I think there's some guys that were taking some selfish swings. Well, the last few weeks, you hadn't seen as much of that. And I think the reality of the situation has set into this Mississippi State offense. It's okay, listen, we got to play for each other. We got to go out there and play for the M over S. But we're going to have to put together some separation in these ball games because, these bullpens for Mississippi State, bullpen pitchers have just not been very consistent. You've had some injuries. You've got guys pitching in roles they weren't expected to pitch. And so you've got to have some more margin there. And so I think what you're seeing with this offense is like, hey, we got to go out there and answer the call and give this bullpen pitchers a chance to close out ball games. Because listen, let's be honest, and the proof is in the pudding. You can look at the schedule yourself. State's not going to beat anybody 3-2 or 2-1. It's not going to happen. When at some point you're going to give up runs out of the bullpen, so you've got to find a way to get a bigger lead. We saw it this past Sunday, and when Cade Smith's up 2-0, in the 4th inning, I turned to Mike Nemeth and I said, 2 runs ain't going to be enough to win this ball game. You'd like to have a little more of a lead before you pull Cade Smith, and sure enough, you pull him. The next thing you know, the game is tied, and ultimately State loses 3-2. So that's what I look at is State has got to be able to get quality starts on the mound, and they've got to find a way to get to that Ole Miss bullpen early. And the sooner you can do it in the series, I think it sets up prospects of winning that game on Sunday even more.
Steve, I want to flipping the script a little bit. I want to ask you about last year's national championship run. Obviously, you have one of the greatest books. My future father-in-law has the book, Dogpile. One of the greatest books out there. Truly, as a third party, it's a great book. I want to ask you about what that national championship meant to you as a Mississippi State guy, and also what did it mean to the state of Mississippi to finally get a national championship in college baseball?
Well, first thing I'll say, thank you very much for the kind words. I worked really hard on that book. And in many ways, I think it was probably the book that I was born to write. And I shared in the book. I mean, I've had a love affair with Mississippi State baseball my entire life. And the truth of the matter is, as great as our program history has been, and I would submit to, if you do the math, Mississippi State's probably one of the top dozen college baseball programs in college baseball history. I mean, when you look at what State's done as far as tournament appearances and Omaha appearances, and the one thing we was missing was the national championship. And there were so many people that would say, you know what? State's got all these great attendance records. State's got this, it's a great ballpark, and it's great tradition, it's a great fan base, but they can't win the big one. And we've had so many near misses, back in 1971 and then even in 84 and 85. And we had some great teams, including that 89 team that was the number one team in the tournament and got upset by North Carolina in a regional. And that was just kind of our legacy. It's like, hey, it's been great. There are a lot of people here to see us get to Omaha, but there are not a lot of people that can claim that Mississippi State has really any superiority. And so for the first time ever, State gets over the hump. And it's so crazy how it all went down that I kind of illustrate this in the book. Back in 85, some people argue that 85 and 89 are Mississippi State's two best teams. Well, 89 got upset in the regional, and then 85 has a chance to just enter the national championship final with no losses. And then they drop the game to Texas, where Gene Morgan takes a line drive off the leg, and then Miami walks you off. My dogs are excited. They're upset about Mississippi State getting walked off, but nevertheless, it's like you had to beat Texas. It's like you're exercising that old demon of 85. You got to find a way to get through Texas. Well, they do. And then the modern foil has been Vanderbilt. And people forget. I mean, State's kind of held their own in this deal with Vanderbilt too. I mean, back in 18, State goes to Vandy, wins a super regional. It hasn't been a one-sided type deal, but Vandy's always been that team. It's been the measuring stick in the last decade or so. And there were times State didn't measure up. And so not only do you close that loop of 85, but you kind of handle this more recent generation of college baseball, and you beat the defending national champions in very emphatic fashion. And so I think it was very apropos, but also too, it's a long time coming. And I was there with my son in the ninth inning, and I told him, I said, I'm so glad you didn't have to live as long as me to see Mississippi State win a national title.
Steve, that gives chills right down my spine, even as a Kentucky and Memphis fan. I think that is truly, it's what it's all about. I mean, when you look at college athletics, and I got to have that opportunity with my dad in 2012 when Kentucky won a national championship in basketball. You relish those opportunities to spend with your kid. And I want to close with this. And, you and I were talking about before we came on the air here. I want to ask you about this Mississippi State fan base. You've been to all 14 schools out of the SEC. I've been to 10 out of the 14 schools in the SEC. And truly, there is not a nicer, more genuine fan base than the Mississippi State fan base. Every time I've been to Starkville, super nice people. People offering you food, drink, tailgate hospitality, everything you can dream of. Even in the stadium, even if the cowbells get a little annoying, they're super nice. They are just tremendous. I want to ask you about that Mississippi State fan base. What makes them so special? And what does Mississippi State mean to you and your family?
Well, the first thing that I would say is that if we're all fortunate enough to get to heaven, there'll be cowbells in heaven, because I think we're God's people. But that said, it's very kind of you to say, and I have traveled, and I've had so many great experiences around the Southeastern Conference. I mean, it's like, we laugh about Twitter and social media and that kind of stuff. You've got lunatic fringe associated with every single fan base, and sometimes it's the worst representatives of those fan bases that get the most attention. But I really haven't had many negative experiences out there. But the more that I travel and the more people that I meet, the more I realize how special this thing is at Mississippi State. I mean, it's kind of as you described. I mean, there's nobody at Mississippi State that wants you to go home with a negative feeling about Starkville or Mississippi State. Now, we want you to lose the ball game. Don't get me wrong, but we don't want you to walk away feeling like, oh, the people were awful. And that's not to say that, that we don't have, some fans that are difficult. I just think we've got a smaller percentage than most. But, it's great to be a part of this family. My dad, I shared this recently. My dad was one of 13 kids. He grew up on a dairy farm in Jones County, Mississippi, and the only one of his siblings that earned a bachelor's degree. A lot of them went to the junior college for a year or two, but he was the one that did it, and he wanted a better life for me. And I wasn't even born yet. I was just an idea, and he wanted me to have a better life than he had. And he came to Mississippi State, and he didn't want the burden of the financial responsibility to all fall to his parents. I mean, they still had kids at home they had to raise. He had a farm to run, and so my dad went to work in the work study, and he milked cows at 5 a.m. every day at Mississippi State. And he'd go to class, and he would go back in the afternoon and help all those guys do the second milking for free, just because he wanted those guys to have a chance to go study. And then at night, after he would study and eat dinner with my mom, who lived with him in marital housing, he would drive the street sweeper at Mississippi State as part of his work study. And he did that 6 days a week. And then he ultimately graduated. And he was so incredibly grateful for the opportunity that Mississippi State afforded him. He went to work for the United States Department of Agriculture for 33 years. And was a Bulldog fan his entire life. And he raised us to be Bulldogs. I always tell people I don't know that I had a choice in the matter. It's just kind of like he was so indebted to Mississippi State that he wanted us to show our same loyalty and appreciation for the opportunities that he had. And my girls are at Mississippi State, and I got one that's graduating, in a few weeks. And I told her, I said, your Papa Fred, my dad, I said he would be so incredibly proud to know that his granddaughter is graduating from Mississippi State, and she spent most of her life in Baton Rouge and always wanted to be a Golden Girl. And she gets up here and she's like, I can't imagine in hindsight now doing anything different. I just love it up here so much. And she's really kind of sad to leave. And she even thought about going to grad school so she could hang around for a little bit longer. But, it really is a family. A lot of people use that as a hashtag or a punchline or anything like that. But there's so many people out there. I mean, there was a time I had some car trouble and I was somewhere, and I get on Twitter and I said, hey, are there any good Bulldog fans near this town? And lo and behold, people start DMing me. And I got people that telling me who to call and how to get my car fixed and where to go. And then 2 other people came and sat with me on the side of the road, until the record got there. I mean, it's just, I don't know that other people have that. And I'm not saying that everybody doesn't, but, it's just a different deal. And I know this, I like to do business with Bulldogs whenever I can. And that's not necessarily just an anti-Ole Miss thing. It's just a pro-Mississippi State thing. I like to keep the business in the family whenever we can. And, it's just so special to be a part of this. And you mentioned the Omaha thing. I mean, you got 26,000 Mississippi State fans going to watch a college baseball game. And we just kind of took over Omaha. And I had some of the guys that were working security. It told me they even worked back at the old Rosenblatt and said, we've never seen anything like this. There were some LSU teams and fans that came, in the late 80s, early 90s that kind of rocked Rosenblatt, but they had never seen anything quite like this. And I think it was because it was just simply our moment. It was just our time. And I think there was this feeling in the Mississippi State fan base that this is our time. And thankfully we went up there and got the thing done. And so we don't have to live with that anymore. We don't have to live with that. Well, Mississippi State can't win the big one. They can get a big crowd. They can win a lot of ball games, but they can't win the big one. We've got a trophy that's ours forever. Nobody can ever take it away from us.
Steve, this kind of leads into this last question. And I thought of this in my last little brain thought here. Is this what the SEC means? Because, we hear the slogan, it just means more. And you hear stories across the entire Southeastern Conference. Obviously, you and I have been around a lot of places. Is this what the SEC means, not only to you, but to everybody, every Southerner who calls the SEC home?
Yeah, I think so. There's, we got the Braves and that sort of stuff, and you got the Preds, but, by and large, the Southeast is SEC country. It's like, the guys that play our sports, and it's not just limited to Mississippi State or the state of Mississippi. The guys that put on an SEC uniform, those guys are heroes forever. Forever. I can give you lineups of all these great teams that I've covered. I can give you the lineups of the teams that I loved as a kid. And I remember, it's like, I think one of the cool things too is, outside of your rival school, everybody's got a favorite player from every other school. It's like, I remember being a kid watching Herschel Walker play back in '82. And it's like, I remember it like it was yesterday, what a big deal it was that Herschel Walker was on our TV. And then you see Bo Jackson and you see all these great players like David Palmer at Alabama. It's like, you start running these things down and it makes you proud to be part of something that is absolutely special. Even when your team is not playing well. You see at the end of the year, people are always like, SEC, you always want to root for the SEC school. And I think fans are probably a little more maybe discriminating now than they were when I was a kid. Used to, if a team from the South did anything, then everybody kind of galvanized behind them. But I think one thing that's special about it is I had so many people in Omaha that were not Mississippi State fans. And I'll give you one quick story about that before we go. Is I met a guy, he was wearing an old LSU cap. And when I say an old LSU cap, this thing hadn't been purple and gold since the early 90s. It's basically white. It's like stained over with sweat. And he's an older guy, and he looked like a guy I used to work with named Charlie Bordelon. He just looked like the typical old South Louisiana Acadian guy that just loves the Tigers. Well, come to find out, he retired in Omaha. He said he got tired of all the Southern summers and he had a chance to retire, and he loved college baseball. And he goes, I just thought, man, the Tigers would be up here every once in a while, and I get to see him up here. And he cooks jambalaya for a lot of people. And And so I see him and I say, hey, man, it's good of you to be here. And he tells me this little story. He goes, let me tell you this. And the guy got like tears in his eyes. He said, man, Mississippi State is the godfathers of SEC baseball. And he goes, it's time you guys got one. He says, so this old Tiger's pulling for these Bulldogs. That meant so much to me. And it's like, it doesn't really matter who all's rooting for who. It doesn't change the outcome. But, to have a guy like that who's been able to celebrate 5 national championships for his own team, be in line to go watch Mississippi State play, because not just his love for the SEC, but his love for college baseball. And really the last thing I'll say about that, and I think it was so big for Mississippi State to win, not just for Mississippi State, but for college baseball, because Mississippi State has probably made the greatest contribution, the greatest investment in college baseball than anybody in the country. You got this, near $70 million stadium up here. You have people to pack and all this, the attendance records. And so you had some other schools, I'm sure, while they would never admit it publicly, probably said, well, why do we want to invest in baseball? Look at what all Mississippi State's done, and they've never won it. Well, now that we've won it, it kind of shows that when you do make an investment, if you really truly get behind baseball, that you can achieve something incredible for the first time really in your program's history. And so not only was it good for us, I think it's good for the game. And I think there are a lot of people out there that says, you know what, maybe we can do this. Maybe we should invest more in college baseball. And we certainly need that. College baseball is treated like a redheaded stepchild by so many college administrators around the country. So I don't think Mississippi State won just for all the Bulldog fans around the country, old, young, and whatever. I think Mississippi State's win is big for everybody that loves the game of college baseball.
He is Steve Robertson. Tell them where they can follow you on Twitter and find literally all of your amazing work. And before we go anywhere, I just want to say this has been an incredible honor. We're going to have to do a part 2, maybe this summer during the off season, just talk about the old stories of Mississippi State, because I could listen to SEC stories until I'm in the grave. I love this conference. There is no better thing than the SEC, and I really appreciate you, Steve, for coming on the Mitch Davis Show.
Sure, absolutely, Mitch. Glad to do it. I'm on all forms of social media at Scout Steve R, and of course, they can find all the Mississippi State work over at genespage.com. We are the 247 Sports Mississippi State affiliate. And they can find Dogpile at dogpilethebook.com. And while they're there, I've got 3 other sports books. And so it's easy. I'm easy to find. And so when people have questions, I'm always eager to talk, and look forward to talking to you in the future.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Steve.